Welcome everyone to Blindfold Chess Training Day 7, and today what we're going to do is endgame puzzles. So we're continuing off from yesterday where we did slightly easier endgame puzzles, and today we're going to do endgame puzzles that are slightly harder, not too much harder but just a bit. So we're going to get into it. So I'm going to read out the pieces, and then for the first couple I'll show where the pieces are indicated on the board, and then you're going to have to try and solve it blindfoldedly. And if you're new to this, I recommend starting from episode 1. And yes, so we're going to start. I have this app on my phone. It's called Blindfold Chess Training. You can download it, and it goes through the puzzles. So this is level 3 of endgame puzzles. And for the first one, it's black to play. So you can still visualize from white's perspective with H1 in the bottom right corner. And I'm going to read out the pieces. So black pieces, we have a king on b3. We have a pawn on c4, and we have a rook on d8. So king b3, pawn c4, and rook d8. Okay, got it. White pieces is king on e3, pawn on c3, pawn on h7, and rook on h3 on h3. So I'm going to draw it out on the first one. So these are black pieces. So king b3, pawn c4, rook d8. And white pieces, king e3, pawn c3, h7, so pawn h7, and rook h3. So here we have to find the winning move for black in this position. So I think it should give it away by the circles, where if you've got this position in your head, it's hard, but if you just keep going through the pieces, it should eventually stick in your head. And if you see, there's actually opposing pawns on this c4 and c3 square. So there's a white pawn on c3, there's a black pawn on c4, and actually it's black to play. Black can give this check, rook d3, give a check to the king has to move, and you can take on h3. And simultaneously, you're stopping the pawn from queening on the next move. So actually black is just simply winning with rook d3 check. So well done if you got that. We're going to move on to another one. And if you're struggling a bit to visualize it, I recommend going back to the first videos and really trying to understand everything from video 1 to 6 of how we did things. But it will get a bit easier. I'll slow it down for the next couple, just in case if anyone is having problems, they can understand it a bit better. Let's go. This one is white to play. White pieces, there's a king on g1, a pawn on g2, so that's pretty easy to know. So king g1, remember the colors of the squares are important as well. g1 dark square, g2 light square, and a rook on b2. So pretty easy. King g1, pawn g2, rook b2. Light work, alright, easy stuff. Now black pieces, they have a king on g5. So if you can visualize that, g file is pretty stacked with pieces. There's a king, there's a pawn, there's 2 blank squares, and then there's a king. They have a pawn on g6. Now there's another piece. There's a pawn on g6. So behind the king is a pawn. They have a bishop on f5. So if you visualize the pawn on g6, f5 is diagonally this way from the pawn, so diagonal to the pawn. So there's a bishop, essentially there's like a trio, a bishop, a king, and a pawn. And they also have a rook on b4. So they have a rook on b4, bishop on f5, pawn on g6, and king on g5. So we have a king here. This is white pieces. Pawn, we have a rook, and they have a pawn, a king, a bishop, and a rook. So when I draw the circles, it's pretty self-explanatory. Yeah, it's white to play, and it's very easy so far. All you have to really see is, okay, what's hanging? Okay, black has a rook hanging. What's the answer? Take the rook. So pretty easy so far, but you have to really get everything in your head. This one is quite easy. Okay, let me up the ante a bit. And now we're on to level 4. Okay, let's do this one. Okay, there's a couple more pieces on this one. Okay, so this is white to play. We have a king on g2, a pawn on h2, so king g2, pawn h2, and a queen on c3. So king g2, pawn h2, queen c3. Only 3 pieces. And remember what color each square is. So g2, light square. h2, dark square. c3, fill in the blank. Dark square. Yeah, good job. Okay, black pieces, king g8, pawn g6, pawn f7, pawn h7, and rook on a6. So let's try and solve this. I'm also trying to solve this at the same time. What I see is essentially a diamond formation with the king on g8. There's pawns on h7, f7, and g6, which is quite typical. Our king and pawn are quite away from the action. g2 and h2, yeah, away from the action. They have a rook on a6, so I'm looking at potential forks. Can I get my queen onto a square such that I hit the king and the rook? And I actually do see one. So if you're keeping track, you should see the move. So pause the video, try and solve it. If you forget the pieces, rewind what I said before. White to play. And well done if you saw the move queen c8 check. Queen is on c3. Queen c8 hits the king and hits the rook on a6. And simply take it on the next move, and that's right. This is a bit too easy. I'm gonna up it a bit. Okay, let's do this one. Okay, this is white to play. White has a king on f2. So king on f2. Pawn on e3. A pawn on g3. So king f2, pawn e2, and pawn g3. Okay. And they have a pawn on f4. Okay. That's also making a shape. And a rook on d2. So if you can visualize that, that actually makes kind of a shape, so it's easy to visualize. f2 is a dark square. And when you have that, you also have the pawn on g3, dark square, e3, dark square, f4, dark square. And you also have a rook on d2. So that is also a dark square. So everything's on a dark square, and it kind of makes a diamond pattern with the rook there as well. So that's pretty easy. Now black pieces, they have a king on e4. So the king is on e4. Okay. They have a pawn on b5. A pawn on f5. Okay. And a rook on b1. So I'm going to try and solve this as well. So, okay, let me go through the pieces again. So from what I remember, I'm actually trying to remember this as well, but I just said the pieces. There was a king on pawn g2. Oh, no, I'm remembering the last one. King f2, pawn g3, pawn f4, pawn e3. There's a white pawn on f5. The king is on e4, our rook is on d2. There's a pawn on b5, and there's a rook on b2, I want to say. b1. And here we have to try and find the move. This actually simplifies it a bit. This is the move I thought it was. I was just remembering the pieces. So yeah, you've probably already paused the video at this point. So the move is rook to d4, which is actually checkmate to the king, because of the pawn on f5 blocks the king's path from going backwards. Okay, let's do a few more. Okay, this one is black to play. Black has a king on g6, a pawn on f5, a pawn on g5, a pawn on h5, and a knight on e7. So g6, king g6, pawn f5, pawn g5, pawn h5, so all together essentially. And a king in behind and a knight on e7. Okay, it's not too bad. And remember, try and remember what color each square is. So g6 light square, and e7 actually, you can go from e7 to g6 via the knight. So that's going to be a light square. And it's pretty easy to remember because it makes like this type of pattern. Oh, not this. This. How do I get rid of this? I want to get rid of the arrows. Okay. e7, pawns, and king. And now white has a king on e3. I'll take this off. King on e3, pawn h3, bishop d6, and queen c7. And this is black to play. I'll say that again for white. King e3, pawn h3, bishop on d6, bishop on d6, yep, and a queen on c7. So here, this, and white has this, bishop, queen c7, king e3, and a pawn on h3. So this is black to play. And yeah, this one's not too difficult. So you should try and see any checks you have. And one stands out, which hits, I mean, as you can see, white has a bishop and a queen and we only have a knight. So it's going to be a knight fork against the queen. We have this check on d5, attacking the king, attacking the queen. We take the queen. So knight e5 check is the right move. Okay, let's go to the next one. And for this one, I will just say the pieces. I'll have you pause the video. If you need to repeat it. And yeah, try and solve it. So black, this is black to play. Black has a king on f5, pawn d5, pawn g5, rook c1. White has a king on g3, pawn f2, pawn e3, pawn d4, and knight g4. So it's black to play. Pause the video and really try and visualize everything in your mind. If you can't, replay the video a few times from where I started talking. Okay, the move is rook g1. So the position looks a bit like this. There's pawns f2, e3, d4. Black has pawns here. d5, g5. Black has a king here. And black has a rook here. There's a knight on g4, there's a king on g3. Now if we give a check, we force the king to move. And wherever the king moves, we take the knight on the next move. So pretty good, that one. And now I'll go through some that you can go through on your own. So a few puzzles. And you can write down in the comments what you think the answers are. I'll give 5. So actually, the first one we'll solve together because these ones will have 6 pieces. Actually, I'll stick to 5. I'll stick to 5. I'll stick to 9 pieces for this level 5. Okay. This is black to play. This one, black has king d5, pawn b4, pawn f5, pawn a6. White has king on f3, pawn a2, pawn b3, pawn f4, knight c5. That's black to play. Solve it, write down your answer in the comments. Next one, black to play. Black has a king on b4, pawn f5, knight d5, bishop c3. White has a king on d3, pawn h3, pawn f4, pawn g4, and a bishop on e6. So that's the next one. Now we're on to the next one. This is white to play. White has a king on f2, a pawn on d3, pawn on h3, pawn on f5, rook on e4. Black has a king on d6, a pawn on d4, a pawn on f6, and a rook on a6. So a couple more. White to play. White has a king on e3, pawn on a2, knight d2, bishop f3. Black has a king on f6, pawn a4, pawn g4, pawn h5, and rook g3. Last one. This is white to play. White has a king on e3, pawn f3, pawn h4, knight d3. Black has a king on c4, pawn on b5, pawn on h5, pawn on f7, and a bishop on d1. Okay, that is going to do us for today. So I'll see you all tomorrow for the next episode. And yeah, so this is ramping up for sure. It will get slightly easier since this is endgame puzzles. Slightly trickier because you don't have the start of the game to go to. You know where all the pieces are. You know your opening. Here, I'm just putting pieces on the board and you're having to visualize. Especially endgame calculation is a bit harder. But yeah, it will probably get a little easier before it gets harder again. Okay, see you all tomorrow.